The eviction notice was taped to the door, and Marcus Reed stood on the porch reading it for the third time, hoping the words would change if he stared long enough. They did not. 7 days. That was all he had left before the landlord would change the locks. Behind him, inside the small rented house, his daughter Lily coughed again, a deep rattling sound that made his chest tighten. She was 8 years old and had been sick for 4 days, and the only medicine that worked cost more than he had in his pocket. He folded the notice, shoved it into his jacket, and walked back inside. His younger daughter, Grace, was sitting at the kitchen table drawing pictures of a house with a big yellow sun above it. She did not know they might lose this one soon. Marcus forced a smile for her, then walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub with his head in his hands. It had been 11 months since he lost his job at the parts factory. 11 months of applications, interviews that led nowhere, and polite rejection emails that all said the same thing in different words. He was 34 years old, a widower raising 2 girls alone, and every door he knocked on seemed to close a little faster than the last. That night, after the girls were asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, the blue light of the screen the only light in the room. He typed the same search he had typed hundreds of times. Jobs near me. Hiring now. He almost closed the laptop when a new listing appeared at the top of the page. Halden Industries. Janitorial staff needed. Immediate start. He did not know much about the company, only that it was a large manufacturing business on the edge of town, the kind of place with a tall glass entrance and a parking lot full of clean cars. He almost scrolled past it. A voice in his head told him he was better than mopping floors, that he had once supervised 12 men on a factory line. But desperation is a great equalizer, and Lily's cough echoed down the hallway as if reminding him what mattered. He clicked apply. The form took 10 minutes to fill out. He listed his work history, his years at the factory, the reason for the gap in employment, which he wrote honestly, caring for his children after the passing of his wife. He did not dress it up. He did not hide it. He clicked submit and closed the laptop, unsure if anyone would ever read it. 3 days passed with no word. On the 4th day, his phone rang with a number he did not recognize. A woman's voice, brisk but kind, introduced herself as Nora from the Human Resources office at Halden Industries. She asked if he could come in for an interview the next morning at 9. Marcus barely slept that night. He ironed the only dress shirt he owned, a pale blue one with a small stain near the collar that he tried to hide with a jacket. He borrowed his neighbor's car because his own would not start, and he arrived at the Halden building 20 minutes early, sitting in the parking lot and watching employees walk in through the glass doors, all of them looking like they belonged somewhere he did not. Inside, the lobby was bright and cold with polished floors that reflected the ceiling lights. A young man in a security uniform pointed him toward the elevators, and Marcus rode up to the 3rd floor where the interview would take place. He was led into a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the parking lot he had just been sitting in. The interviewer was a man named Craig, someone from the operations department, not the type who usually handled janitorial hiring, but that day the schedule had shifted, and he had been asked to fill in. Craig shook his hand, sat down, and opened a folder with Marcus's application inside. The questions were simple at first: availability, physical ability to lift and move equipment, comfort working night shifts. Marcus answered each one clearly, keeping his hands folded on the table to stop them from shaking. Then Craig asked about the gap in his work history, and Marcus told him the truth without flinching, that his wife had passed 2 years earlier, that he had taken time to make sure his daughters were safe and cared for, before searching for steady work again. Craig nodded slowly, writing something down. He did not offer sympathy, which Marcus appreciated, because sympathy from strangers had never once paid a bill. Instead, Craig asked practical questions about his old job at the factory, how he had managed a team, how he handled pressure when machines broke down during a shift. Marcus answered honestly, describing long nights keeping production lines running, solving problems on the spot, making sure workers under him went home safe. Near the end of the interview, Craig looked up from his notes with a curious expression, as though something did not quite fit. A man with supervisory experience applying for a janitorial position was not common, but he said nothing about it. He simply closed the folder and told Marcus that his application would be reviewed and passed along, and that someone would be in touch soon. Marcus left the building unsure of what that meant. Passed along could mean anything. It could mean nothing. He drove the borrowed car home, picked up a bottle of children's medicine from the pharmacy with the last bit of cash in his wallet, and spent the evening pressing a cool cloth to Lily's forehead while Grace slept beside her sister, unaware of how close they were to losing the roof over their heads. 2 days later, Marcus's application did something unusual. Instead of being processed by the standard hiring team and forgotten among dozens of others, it was flagged for final review, a routine step for any hire at Halden Industries, but one that normally received only a passing glance from senior management. This time, it landed on the desk of someone who rarely reviewed janitorial applications personally. Diane Halden, the chief executive of the company her family had built over 3 decades, sat in her office that afternoon, signing off on a stack of routine paperwork. Hiring approvals were usually the fastest part of her day, barely requiring more than a glance at a name and a signature. She flipped through pages without much thought, until she reached one particular file. She stopped moving. Her pen hovered above the paper. The name at the top of the page read Marcus Reed, and beneath it, a short paragraph about his work history and the reason for his employment gap. Diane read it once, then again, her breath catching somewhere in her chest. She set the pen down and stared at the page as though it might rearrange itself into a different name, a different story. Her assistant, Nora, noticed the change immediately. She had worked beside Diane for 6 years and had never seen her employer go still like that over a single piece of paper. Diane asked her, in a voice quieter than usual, to pull every detail available on the applicant, his full address history, his previous employment records, anything the file did not already show. Nora asked no questions, though she wanted to. For the rest of the afternoon, Diane could not focus on anything else. She kept the file open on her desk, glancing at it between meetings, her mind pulled back 20 years to a night she had never fully spoken about to anyone outside her family. She remembered headlights. She remembered smoke rising from twisted metal on a stretch of highway outside of town. She remembered a stranger's hands pulling her father free of a wreck that should have taken his life. She had searched for that man for years afterward, hiring people to track down any information they could find, but the trail had gone cold. He had moved away, changed jobs, and seemingly vanished from every record she and her family tried to follow. Eventually, the search quieted, though it never fully stopped living in the back of her mind. Now, seemingly out of nowhere, a name from that night sat printed on a job application for a position sweeping floors in her own company. She told herself it might be a coincidence. Reed was not an uncommon surname, but something in the details, the town he had lived in around that time, the age that matched almost exactly, made her stomach twist with a feeling she could not shake. She needed to know for certain before she let herself hope. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Diane sat alone in her office with the lights dimmed, looking out over the parking lot below. She thought about her father, now retired and living quietly 2 hours away, a man who still walked with a slight limp from injuries sustained that night, a permanent reminder of how close her family had come to losing him. She thought about the birthdays he had celebrated since then, the grandchildren he had held, the ordinary mornings that would never have happened without a stranger's help. She picked up her phone and called her father directly, something she rarely did during work hours. When he answered, she asked him a single question, careful not to explain why she was asking. Did he remember the name of the man who had helped him that night, all those years ago? There was a long pause on the line before her father answered quietly, telling her a name he had never forgotten despite the years, a name that matched the one sitting on her desk. Diane sat frozen after the call ended, staring at the folder in front of her. It was him. After 2 decades of silence, of searching, of wondering whether the man who saved her father was even still alive, he was sitting in her own hiring system, applying for a job that paid barely enough to survive on. She knew, in that moment, that she could not simply approve or deny the application like any other. Something larger than a job opening was unfolding, though she did not yet know what shape it would take. She only knew that she needed to see him, to speak with him herself, before anyone else touched his file again. The next morning, she asked Nora to arrange a private meeting, not through the standard hiring department, but directly through her own office. She gave no explanation beyond saying it was a personal matter. Nora, sensing the seriousness in her tone, made the call herself, informing Marcus that the company wished to speak with him again, this time with someone from senior leadership. Marcus received the call while sitting beside Lily's bed, relieved that the medicine had finally brought her fever down. He assumed it was simply another step in the hiring process, perhaps a background check or a final confirmation. He had no way of knowing that across town, a woman he had never met was preparing to look him in the eye for the first time in 20 years, carrying with her a debt she had waited 2 decades to repay. The morning of the second meeting, Marcus stood in front of his closet, trying to decide which shirt looked less worn than the other. He settled on the same blue shirt from before, freshly washed, the small stain near the collar scrubbed until it faded into something barely noticeable. He dropped Grace and Lily at his neighbor's house, promising he would be back before lunch, and borrowed the same car again, silently thanking the neighbor for her patience. The drive to Halden Industries felt longer this time, though the distance had not changed. His mind kept circling around questions he could not answer. Why would senior leadership want to speak with him directly for a janitorial role? Was something wrong with his application? Had they discovered something in his background that made them suspicious? He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter with each mile, trying to steady his breathing before he arrived. When he walked into the lobby, the same young security guard recognized him and offered a small nod, though this time he was directed not to the 3rd floor, but to the executive level near the top of the building. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as the elevator doors closed. He had never been on an executive floor in his life. The factory he once worked at barely had an office beyond a small trailer near the loading docks. The elevator opened onto a hallway lined with framed photographs, images of the company through the decades, black and white pictures of a small workshop slowly transforming into the glass building he now stood inside. He walked past a photograph of a much younger Diane Halden standing beside an older man with silver hair and a warm smile, though Marcus did not linger long enough to study it closely. Nora greeted him near the reception desk, her expression polite but unreadable. She offered him a seat in a small waiting area near Diane's office, telling him it would only be a few minutes. Marcus sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching people move briskly through the hallway, each one absorbed in their own tasks, none of them aware of the storm quietly building behind the closed door just a few feet away. Inside her office, Diane stood by the window, arms crossed, trying to organize her thoughts before the meeting began. She had barely slept the night before, her mind pulled back again and again to a night 20 years earlier that she had tried for so long to place gently in the past. She remembered the call that had come in just after midnight, her mother's voice trembling on the other end of the line, saying only that there had been an accident on the highway, that her father was involved, that emergency services were already on their way. Diane had driven through the night not knowing whether he was alive or not, her hands shaking so badly she had nearly missed the turn onto the highway herself. By the time she arrived, the road had been blocked off, red and blue lights flashing against the dark trees lining the highway. She remembered standing at the edge of the scene, held back by a police officer, watching smoke rise from a car that had rolled and crushed against the guardrail. She remembered calling out her father's name, though the sound barely carried over the noise of sirens and shouting. What she learned later, pieced together from witnesses and a brief statement given at the scene, was that a stranger driving behind her father's car had seen the crash happen in front of him. Without waiting for help to arrive, without knowing whether the car might catch fire completely, the stranger had pulled over, moved through smoke and broken glass, and worked to free her father from the wreckage before emergency crews reached them. He had stayed close by even as the danger remained, staying until paramedics finally arrived and took over. The stranger gave a brief statement to police, declined to give more than his first name in the confusion of the moment, and left before anyone thought to ask for a way to contact him again. It was only weeks later, when her father was recovering and able to speak clearly about that night, that he remembered more details, enough for the family to begin searching. They learned his full name from a witness who had exchanged a few words with him at the scene. Marcus Reed. A name that had lived quietly in the back of every family gathering since, spoken with gratitude, but never followed by an actual face to attach it to. Diane had spent months, then years, trying to track him down through public records, hoping to properly thank him, to let him know what his actions had meant to her family. But people move, addresses change, and eventually the search had faded into something they simply carried with them, a debt owed to someone whose face they could no longer clearly picture. Now that same name sat outside her office door, attached to a real person waiting nervously on a small couch, unaware that the woman about to speak with him had thought about him more times over the past 20 years than he could ever imagine. Diane took a slow breath, smoothed the front of her blazer, and asked Nora to bring him in. Marcus stood as the door opened, his hands instinctively straightening his shirt. Diane extended her hand, and he shook it, noting the firm, steady grip of someone used to leading rooms much larger than this one. She introduced herself simply as Diane, without listing her title, and gestured for him to sit across from her at a small round table near the window, rather than behind her large desk, something Marcus noticed but did not fully understand the meaning of. For a moment neither of them spoke. Diane studied his face carefully, searching for any resemblance to the blurred memory she had carried for 20 years, a stranger glimpsed only briefly through smoke and flashing lights. She found it difficult to reconcile that fragmented memory with the calm, tired man sitting across from her now, dressed neatly, despite clear signs of hardship. She began by asking him general questions, similar to the ones from his first interview, though her tone carried a warmth that felt different from a standard hiring conversation. She asked about his daughters, and his expression softened slightly as he spoke about Lily's recent illness and Grace's drawings of houses with bright yellow suns. Diane listened closely, storing away every detail, though her mind kept circling back to the larger question she had not yet found the courage to ask. She asked him where he had grown up, and he answered honestly, naming a small town 2 hours outside the city, the same town her father had been driving through the night of the accident. She asked how long he had lived there, and he told her nearly his whole life until moving closer to the city a few years back for work. Every answer lined up a little more precisely with the picture forming in her mind, though she still had not said a single word about why she was truly asking. Marcus, for his part, grew increasingly confused by the direction of the conversation. He had expected questions about cleaning schedules, equipment handling, perhaps a background check confirmation. Instead, he found himself discussing his childhood, his years working at the factory, even brief mentions of his late wife, all met with careful, attentive listening from a woman whose title he still did not fully understand. At one point, he asked cautiously whether something was wrong with his application, whether there had been an issue uncovered somewhere in his background. Diane shook her head quickly, assuring him nothing was wrong, though her voice carried a slight unsteadiness that made him even more uncertain about what was happening. She excused herself briefly, stepping toward the window to gather her thoughts, her back turned to him for a long moment. Marcus watched her shoulders rise and fall with a slow breath, sensing that whatever conversation they were truly having had not yet begun. When she turned back around, her eyes were slightly glassy, though her voice remained steady, as she asked him one final question before revealing anything further. She asked if he remembered a night, many years ago, involving a car accident on the highway just outside his hometown. She asked if he remembered stopping to help a stranger trapped inside a wrecked vehicle. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, an old memory rising slowly to the surface, one he had not thought about in years, buried beneath the weight of everything that had happened in his life since. He answered slowly, admitting that yes, he remembered a night like that, though the details had faded with time, and he had never learned what became of the man he pulled from the wreck. Diane's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a framed photograph sitting on a side table near the window, the same photograph Marcus had glimpsed briefly in the hallway earlier. She carried it over and set it gently on the table between them, her finger resting lightly on the image of the older man with silver hair standing beside her. She told him, her voice barely above a whisper, that the man in the photograph was her father, that the accident he was asking about had nearly taken her father's life, that her family had searched for years, unable to properly thank the stranger who had saved him, that she now understood, with certainty, that the stranger was sitting across from her at this very table. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long moment, pieces of a night he had tried to forget, slowly rearranging themselves into a clearer picture. He remembered the heat of the wreck against his skin, the panicked shouting of the man trapped inside, the sound of sirens finally arriving in the distance. He remembered leaving before anyone could ask too many questions, uncomfortable with attention, wanting only to return to his own quiet life afterward. He had never known the man's name. He had never known he had a daughter searching for him for 20 years. He sat in silence, overwhelmed by the sudden collision of his past and present, unsure of what to say to the woman sitting across from him, her eyes now openly filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. The silence between them stretched long enough that Nora, waiting just outside the door, began to wonder if something had gone wrong. Inside the office, neither Marcus nor Diane seemed to notice the passing time. Marcus finally broke the quiet, his voice low and uneven, asking her to tell him everything, from the beginning, because his own memory of that night had always felt like fragments rather than a whole story. Diane took a seat across from him again, folding her hands together as though steadying herself before speaking. She told him her father had been driving home late from a business trip, alone on a stretch of highway known for sharp curves and poor lighting. A tire had blown without warning, sending the car spinning across the road before it struck the guardrail and rolled once before coming to a stop against a line of trees. She explained that witnesses who called for help said the car had begun smoking almost immediately, and that no one dared approach until a man driving behind him pulled over without hesitation. That man had run toward the wreck, ignoring the danger, and worked quickly to free her father from a door that had jammed shut in the crash. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, the memory sharpening now as she spoke. He remembered the smell of burning rubber, the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled, and a man's voice inside the car, dazed and pleading for help. He remembered pulling at the door with everything he had, his hands cut and bleeding from broken glass, until it finally gave way enough for him to reach inside. He told her, quietly, that he remembered talking to her father the entire time, telling him to stay calm, that help was coming, that he was not going to let him stay trapped in there. He remembered the man's hand gripping his arm tightly, refusing to let go even after he had pulled him free and moved him a safe distance from the vehicle. He remembered staying beside him on the cold ground until the ambulance lights finally appeared in the distance. Diane listened with tears sliding freely down her face now, hearing details of that night she had never known before, details her father had never fully described, because the shock of the moment had blurred so much of it for him. She told Marcus that her father had suffered a broken leg, several cracked ribs, and a head injury that kept him in the hospital for nearly 3 weeks. But he had lived. He had recovered. He had walked her down the aisle at her wedding 4 years later, though with a slight limp that never fully went away. He had held each of his grandchildren the day they were born. He had celebrated birthdays, holidays, ordinary Sunday mornings, all of it made possible by a stranger who disappeared into the night before anyone could properly thank him. Marcus sat with the weight of her words settling over him slowly. He had thought about that night occasionally over the years, wondering if the man had survived, but life had pulled him in so many directions since then that the memory had faded into something distant, almost like a dream he was not entirely sure had been real. Hearing now that the man had lived a full life since, that he had grandchildren, that his daughter had never stopped searching for the person who saved him, filled Marcus with an emotion he struggled to name. He told her, honestly, that he had never thought of himself as someone who did anything extraordinary that night. He had simply reacted, the way he believed anyone would in that moment, without weighing the danger to himself. He told her he had left before speaking with anyone at length, because he had never been comfortable with attention, and because he had needed to get home to his own family waiting for him. Diane shook her head gently, telling him that not everyone would have stopped that night, that many drivers had passed the accident before he arrived, slowing down out of curiosity, but continuing on their way without helping, that it took a particular kind of courage to run toward danger instead of away from it, and that her family had spent 20 years wishing they could simply say thank you to the man who had done exactly that. She reached across the table and asked if she could see the details of his current situation, gently, without pressure, simply because she wanted to understand where his life had led him since that night. Marcus hesitated, feeling a familiar discomfort rise in his chest, the same discomfort that had always made it hard for him to accept help from anyone. But something about her sincerity made him open up in a way he rarely did with strangers. He told her about his wife, how they had built a small but happy life together before an illness took her far too soon, leaving him alone with 2 young daughters, and a grief he still carried quietly every day. He told her about losing his factory job when the company downsized, about the string of rejections that followed, about nights spent calculating how far he could stretch what little money remained before something had to give. He told her about Lily's recent illness, about the medicine that had used the last of his savings, about the eviction notice currently folded inside his jacket pocket, a detail he had not planned on sharing, but that slipped out before he could stop himself. Diane's expression shifted from sorrow to something firmer, more resolved, as she listened. She had spent 20 years imagining what she would say if she ever found the man who saved her father, rehearsing words of gratitude in quiet moments when the memory resurfaced unexpectedly. But sitting across from him now, hearing the reality of his struggles, she realized that words alone would never feel like enough. She excused herself for a moment, stepping out of the office to speak quietly with Nora in the hallway. Marcus sat alone with the photograph still resting on the table, studying the face of the man he had once pulled from a burning wreck, a face that had aged gracefully in the years since, surrounded now by family and the image Diane had chosen to keep close. When Diane returned, she carried with her a different kind of energy, something more determined than emotional. She sat down again, looked him directly in the eyes, and told him that she had no intention of simply offering him the janitorial position he had originally applied for. She told him she wanted to do something more, something that reflected both her family's gratitude and her genuine respect for the skills and character he had demonstrated throughout his life, both 20 years ago on that highway and in the years since, raising 2 daughters alone while carrying more weight than most people would ever have to bear. Marcus felt his chest tighten at her words, uncertain where the conversation was heading, uncertain whether he was ready to accept whatever she was about to offer. He had spent so long being the one who helped others, who stepped in without hesitation, that the idea of receiving something significant in return felt foreign, almost uncomfortable, as though it might upset some invisible balance he had maintained his entire life. Diane seemed to sense his hesitation, softening her tone as she continued. She told him this was not charity, not a handout given out of pity or obligation. She told him it was simply the truth finally catching up to 20 years of gratitude that had never found its proper place to land. She told him her father would want to meet him, would want to know that after all these years, the man who saved his life was finally sitting in the very building built by the family he had protected, without ever asking for anything in return. Marcus glanced down at his hands, the same hands that had pulled a stranger from a wreck 2 decades earlier, now calloused from years of factory work and worn thin from months of financial struggle. He thought about Lily and Grace waiting for him at the neighbor's house, about the eviction notice still folded in his pocket, about how close he had come to losing everything just days before receiving a phone call that had somehow led him here, sitting across from a woman whose entire family owed their continued existence to a decision he made in less than a minute, 20 years ago, without a single thought of reward. He did not yet know what Diane intended to offer him, but he understood, sitting there in that quiet office with the photograph of her father resting between them, that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet fully imagine. Diane stood and walked to a cabinet near the far wall of her office, pulling out a second folder that Marcus had not noticed before. She placed it on the table beside the photograph and opened it slowly, revealing several printed pages detailing a position within the company's operations department, a role overseeing logistics and staff coordination, far removed from the janitorial listing he had originally applied for. She explained that after reading through his original application, she had already noticed his years of supervisory experience at the factory, his ability to manage teams under pressure, his steady record of showing up and solving problems even when circumstances around him were difficult. She told him that even before recognizing his name, something about his file had stood out among the stack of routine applications crossing her desk that week. Marcus stared at the pages, unsure how to respond. He asked her plainly if this offer had anything to do with what happened on the highway all those years ago, needing to understand whether this was simply a debt being repaid, rather than a genuine reflection of his abilities. He told her he did not want a position handed to him out of guilt or obligation, that he would rather clean floors honestly than accept something built on pity. Diane appreciated the directness of his question and answered it just as plainly. She told him the position existed regardless of who he was, that the operations department had been searching for someone with exactly his kind of experience for months. She told him the connection between them only meant that she had taken the time to look closely at his file instead of letting it pass through the standard process without a second glance, something she now realized may have overlooked him entirely otherwise. She admitted, however, that she could not separate the two things completely. She told him that recognizing his name had given her a reason to look deeper into his application, to notice details a rushed reviewer might have missed, and that once she saw the full picture of his abilities, she knew the janitorial position would have been a waste of what he could actually offer the company. She told him this was not a debt repaid through a title alone, but an opportunity extended because he had earned it twice over, once on a dark highway 20 years ago, and once through every difficult year since. Marcus sat quietly, weighing her words carefully. He thought about the pride that had kept him from asking others for help throughout the hardest months of his life. The same pride that made this moment feel both like a gift and a test. He thought about his daughters, about the eviction notice, about the medicine bottle sitting nearly empty on his kitchen counter, and he understood that whatever discomfort he felt about accepting this offer mattered far less than the stability it could bring his family. Still, he hesitated, telling Diane honestly that he needed to think it over, that his instinct was always to refuse anything that felt too generous, too sudden, without fully understanding the terms. Diane respected his caution, telling him to take whatever time he needed, though she gently reminded him that Lily's health and the security of his home would not wait indefinitely for a decision. She then addressed something else weighing on her mind, something she had noticed while reviewing his file more closely that morning. She told him that beyond the job offer itself, she wanted to help address his immediate situation, the overdue rent, the medical costs, the months of accumulated financial strain that no single paycheck could fix overnight. She proposed connecting him with a company assistance program typically reserved for long-term employees facing hardship, offering to make an exception given the unusual circumstances surrounding his application. Marcus felt his throat tighten at the offer, an old instinct rising up telling him to refuse, to insist he could manage on his own the way he always had. But he thought of Lily's cough, of Grace's drawings of a house they might not get to keep much longer, and he swallowed his pride long enough to accept her help, telling her quietly that he would find a way to repay every bit of it once he was back on steady footing. Diane shook her head at that, telling him gently that some debts were never meant to be repaid in the way he was imagining, that the truest form of repayment would simply be watching him and his daughters thrive without the constant shadow of financial fear hanging over them. She told him that her father, upon learning that his rescuer had been found after 20 years, would likely feel the same way. Before Marcus left the building that day, Diane asked one more question, this one carrying a different kind of weight than everything before it. She asked if he would be willing to meet her father in person, whenever he felt ready, so that the man whose life he had saved could finally offer his thanks after 2 decades of searching. Marcus agreed without hesitation, understanding instinctively that this was a moment neither of them could skip past, regardless of how uncertain he still felt about everything else unfolding around him. He left the building that afternoon carrying the folder detailing his new position, along with contact information for the assistance program Diane had arranged. He sat in the borrowed car in the parking lot for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the tall glass building in his rearview mirror, trying to process how drastically his circumstances had shifted within the span of a single conversation. When he arrived to pick up his daughters, Grace ran to him immediately, holding up a new drawing she had made that afternoon, a house with 2 sons instead of 1. Marcus knelt down and hugged her tightly, feeling tears sting the corners of his eyes, for reasons his daughter could not fully understand. Lily, feeling much better since the medicine had taken effect, asked if they were still going to lose their house, a question she had overheard him discussing quietly on the phone days earlier despite his efforts to shield her from it. Marcus told her, with more certainty than he had felt in months, that they were not going anywhere. He told her their home was safe, that things were going to get easier from here, though he did not yet have the words to explain the full weight of what had happened that day. Both girls seemed satisfied with his answer, returning to their drawings and games without further questions, unaware that a debt from long before their lifetime had just quietly reshaped their future. Over the following days, Marcus worked through the details of his new position with Nora, who guided him patiently through paperwork, benefits, and the logistics of his upcoming start date. The assistance program covered his overdue rent in full, along with a portion of his outstanding medical expenses, lifting a weight from his shoulders that had pressed down on him for nearly a year without relief. He called the landlord himself, informing them the balance would be settled, watching the eviction notice lose its power over his life with each passing day. He stood in his kitchen one evening after the girls had gone to sleep, staring at the folded notice sitting on the counter, and finally threw it away, allowing himself, for the first time in months, to breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing against his chest. Yet even as his circumstances improved, Marcus found himself thinking often about the meeting still ahead of him, the moment he would finally stand face to face with the man he had pulled from a burning wreck 20 years earlier. He wondered what he would say, how the man would react, whether their meeting would feel as significant to him as it clearly did to Diane and her family. He did not have to wonder for long, because within 2 weeks, Diane called to arrange exactly that meeting, telling him her father was eager, more than eager, to finally meet him in person. The meeting was arranged for a quiet afternoon at Diane's family home, a modest house set back from a tree-lined street, far removed from the glass towers of Halden Industries. Marcus arrived with his daughters in tow, deciding at the last moment that Lily and Grace should be there to witness this moment with him, a small piece of history their family would carry forward long after he was gone. Walter Halden waited on the porch when they pulled into the driveway, leaning slightly on a cane, the same limp Diane had mentioned still visible in his stance. Marcus stepped out of the car slowly, his heart pounding harder than it had during either interview at the company, and walked toward the porch with his daughters close behind him. Walter studied his face for a long moment, the same way Diane had during their first meeting, searching for traces of a stranger he had only seen clearly for a few frightening minutes 20 years earlier. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and embraced Marcus tightly, his hands gripping the back of Marcus's jacket, the way they had gripped his arm on that dark highway so long ago. Neither man spoke for a while. Marcus felt Walter's shoulders shake slightly, and understood the older man was crying, overwhelmed by a moment he had waited 2 decades to experience. When they finally separated, Walter thanked him simply, his voice thick with emotion, telling him that every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary morning over the past 20 years had existed only because of what Marcus had done that night. Marcus, still uncomfortable with praise, told him quietly that he had only done what needed to be done, that anyone in his position would have acted the same way. Walter shook his head firmly, telling him that many people had driven past that night without stopping, and that it took a rare kind of person to run toward danger instead of away from it. He told Marcus that his family had never stopped being grateful, even during the years when the trail had gone cold, and they feared they might never find him again. Grace and Lily stood quietly beside their father during the exchange, sensing the importance of the moment even without fully understanding every detail. Walter knelt down slightly, wincing at the movement of his old injury, and thanked them as well, telling them their father was the reason he had lived long enough to become a grandfather himself, long enough to watch his own grandchildren grow up the way Lily and Grace were growing up now. They spent the rest of the afternoon sitting together on the porch, sharing a simple meal Diane had prepared, the conversation flowing easily between stories of the past and hopeful plans for the future. Walter asked about Marcus's late wife, listening with genuine sympathy, as Marcus spoke about her briefly, something he rarely did with people outside his closest circle. Diane watched from a distance, finally feeling a sense of peace settle over a chapter of her family's history that had remained open and unresolved for far too long. In the months that followed, Marcus began his new role at Halden Industries, adjusting steadily to the responsibilities of overseeing logistics and coordinating staff schedules. He approached the work with the same steady determination that had carried him through years of hardship, quickly earning the respect of colleagues who initially knew nothing about the story behind his hiring. He worked hard, arrived early, stayed late when needed, and treated every member of his team with the same fairness and patience he had once shown his co-workers at the factory years earlier. Word of his story eventually spread through the company, not because Marcus sought attention, but because Diane occasionally shared it during company gatherings, always with his permission, as a reminder to employees that character and quiet acts of courage mattered just as much as qualifications listed on paper. Many employees who heard the story found themselves reflecting on their own daily choices, wondering how they might respond if faced with a similar moment requiring immediate courage. Marcus used his steady income to move his daughters into a slightly larger home, one with a small backyard where Grace could finally have space to run and play, and where Lily's health continued to improve with consistent access to proper care. He set aside savings for the first time in years, slowly rebuilding a sense of security he had once feared was permanently out of reach. He and Walter continued to see each other regularly, their friendship growing steadily beyond the circumstances that had originally brought them together. Walter often visited the Halden Industries offices, simply to have lunch with Marcus, the two of them sitting together in the same building where Marcus now worked, a place that once represented nothing more than a desperate application for a janitorial position. On quiet evenings, after his daughters had gone to sleep, Marcus sometimes found himself thinking back to the night on the highway, to the split-second decision that had sent him running toward a burning wreck instead of driving past like so many others had. He had never once expected anything in return for that choice, and for 20 years, he had gone about his life believing it was simply one small moment among countless ordinary days. Yet that single decision, made without hesitation on a dark and dangerous night, had quietly shaped the course of his entire future, arriving exactly when his family needed it most, offering not just financial relief, but a renewed sense of purpose and connection to people who genuinely cared about his well-being. He often told his daughters as they grew older and began to understand the full story behind their new home and their father's new career, that kindness given freely, without expectation of reward, has a way of returning when it is needed most, sometimes carried across 20 years and delivered by the last person anyone would expect. Marcus Reed never set out to be anyone's hero. He simply stopped his car on a dark highway because someone needed help, and he never thought about it again, until the day a stranger's name on an old photograph reminded the world exactly what one small act of courage can grow into, decades later, when it finally finds its way home.